I have the honour to speak to you again, representing Larbert Baptist Church, and to give a thought for the day on this Monday, the 15th of November. What's your response at the end of a sermon? Do you think, oh, now I can get away? One kind friend once said to me, "You spend half an hour telling us something that I could define in 2 minutes. Faithful are the wounds of a friend." Such bald statements are fairly rare. Usually at the end of the service, when I have poured my heart out, the comment might be at the door, "Looks like rain again," or "My indigestion's playing havoc with me," or some such inspiring comments. The Saviour preached a very long sermon. We have the manuscript of it, as a matter of fact. Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5, 6 and 7. You can test the length of it, because if you actually sit down and read, it will take you quite a time. And this is called the Sermon on the Mount, because the Saviour climbed a mountain, found a good vantage spot and sat down, and his disciples gathered around him, and I'm pretty sure quite a hefty lot of other people came as well. And he preached the Sermon on the Mount. It's an interesting fact, incidentally, that the editorial design of the Gospel of Matthew begins with 3 chapters, 5, 6, 7, of the Saviour's uninterrupted preaching. And at the end of his ministry, chapters 23, 24, 25, again, uninterrupted preaching, teaching. But we actually have the response that the people gave to the Saviour's Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus had ended these sayings, we read in Matthew 7, verses 28, 29. When Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught as one having authority, not as the scribes. They were astonished. It's no exaggeration to say that the Greek word used for astonished could be knocked out. They were knocked out. They were given such a blow in their thinking that they were knocked right out of the ring and sent sprawling on the grass. They were absolutely astonished. They had never heard anything like this. I told you we have the manuscript of the sermon, and we can read it. And, well, when you read it, yes, it's jolly good, but doesn't seem to rivet you. I mean, the more you dig into it, the more wonderful it becomes. I assure you, more wonderful. No words can express how wonderful it is when you dig into it. But those people didn't dig into it. They didn't have the opportunity. There and then, they were absolutely knocked out with this sermon. So I ask, why? What was it about that sermon that was knocking them out? Was so riveting, so enthralling? What was it? Well, there are several reasons that in my asking that question and seeking the answer, I think can explain it. But here's one, and this is it. Every word which Christ spoke was framed in the light of an impending, overwhelming, unstoppable, inescapable, inevitable future which is facing every one of us. And what is that? Well, it's difficult to explain. But this is the future that every one of us is facing. The emergence of all creation from within the dimensions of space and time into eternity. Eternity frames our whole existence. And we are all within the dimensions of space and time. But there will be a huge convulsion, and all creation will emerge from within these dimensions into eternity. You may say, well, that's beyond me. Yes, it is. It's beyond me. But in the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible, after the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11, Solomon writes, God has put eternity into our hearts. And there is something about the human experience and intellectual, emotional, spiritual capacity which somehow feels for the eternal. The COP26 conference in Glasgow, for which we've been diligently praying, has had a twofold agenda, roughly speaking. How to prevent alleged climate change disaster and or how to mitigate the effects of that disaster if it cannot be avoided. But when Christ preached this Sermon on the Mount, there was an apocalyptic future which rises out of our hands. And Christ spoke of that future as framing everything we now think or believe or do. That's true of every one of us. If you are a living human being, this is applicable to you. And that grabbed the disciples and those who were listening to that sermon. It drew them. And once you're alerted to that fact, and you go through the manuscript of the sermon that we have, you realize that, well, that's one of the key features of this sermon. It's all about that which is coming, which is facing us all. He speaks about reward in heaven. He says, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whatever that means, it's apocalyptic in its emphasis. He speaks of the kingdom of heaven. He speaks of hell, fire. He speaks of judgment. He speaks of the way that leads to life, and so on. Everywhere, under the surface, maybe, there is this current of emphasis upon a future we cannot avoid. And the attention of the disciples and others just grew at every word, every word. But what is that eternity to which we are pressing? What is it? Well, I think that I can answer that with this. When the Saviour spoke, he spoke of an eternity from which he had come. Most assuredly, I say to you, we speak what we know and testify what we have seen. I have come into the world, said the Saviour to Pontius Pilate shortly before he was sent to Golgotha to be crucified. I have come into the world that I should bear testimony to the truth. And we read in the last book of the Bible, Revelation, chapter 1, that Jesus Christ is the faithful witness. He has this authority. He is speaking from experience. His life did not begin at Bethlehem. From all eternity, the blessed Son of God was the second person of the blessed, holy, eternal Trinity. And when he took our humanity and was born into this world, it was that he might be the Saviour of the world. And he bore testimony of the eternity from which he had come and to which we will come. But there's another aspect to eternity which is profoundly, inexpressibly serious. As this: eternity is absolutely holy. There is holiness within eternity, and righteousness in everything that is expressed in eternity. It is a context of absolute holiness. We're not used to it. And we live in a sinful world, and, well, we're institutionalized to it. We can't imagine holiness. We can't imagine the motivation of every heart to be unutterably, absolutely righteous. We just can't imagine it. But the eternity to which we are going is holy. And that which is evil cannot survive. We read in the last but one chapter of the Bible, there shall by no means enter eternity anything that defiles or causes an abomination or a lie. It won't have a place in eternity. It will be an atmosphere that evil cannot breathe. It will be a judgment. We read of the day of judgment. How can that be when every thought will be judged, every deed will be judged, every motivation, every impurity in us will be judged? How can that be? Well, in eternity, evil is exposed as an aberration, as something that God never made. It has no place in God's presence. And when we reach eternity, there will be those who are robed in the righteousness of Christ and are, as the apostle says in Romans 8 verse 29, are conformed to the image of God's Son. They're redeemed sinners. They are imperfect, but they have been endued with the perfect loveliness and righteousness of Jesus Christ, the world's Saviour. That's why he came. And alas, I wish I didn't have to say it. There will be those who are not robed in the righteousness of Christ, but only in the rags of their own sin. And they have no place in the presence of God. No place. Oh, think of it. Think of it. I wish I didn't have to be so plain about this, but this is the gospel. Jesus Christ has come into the world that he might save the world. Save it from this virus of evil that is eating out the very image of God, which is the glory of our humanity, that he might destroy the evil and cast the virus into the depths of hell. Yes, cast it there. The eternity to which all creation is pressing is morally, spiritually, of a purity in which the mutating aberration and malforming ugliness of evil cannot survive. The emergence of creation from within the dimensions of space and time will be into a glorious, unfathomable, and radiantly righteous eternity. No wonder the people listened to that sermon with astonishment. And it's about time